Um, Buenos días a todos. Good morning, everyone. I hope I said that in Spanish, and at least I parroted it correctly. Welcome to our panel. It gives me great pleasure to moderate the discussion on PISA for foreign language assessment, which is hopefully coming out in 2026, Catalina? 2027, okay, so forget about the 2025 bit, so think 2027, okay. And I will start by Dr. Nick Saville. I'm not going to really be introducing Nick because I think all of you would know Nick over the years. So Nick will be talking to us about the ever-present need for comparable evidence of foreign language learning and how PISA FLA fits into that. Following Nick, we have Catalina Covacevich. Catalina is the OECD lead on PISA foreign language assessment, but Catalina also Catalina is an economist. She's multilingual and has been working on PISA in general for quite a while. Next to Catalina, we have Angeliki Salamoura, head of operational research in Cambridge, and she will talking to us about what matters for successful language learning and how PISA FLA framework captures these. And our fourth panelist is Martin Robinson, Cambridge lead on test content for PISA for foreign language assessment, and he works on automated assessment within Cambridge. Martin will take us through what PISA FLA 2025-2027 assessment would look like. We will end by opening the floor for Q&A, and before I invite Nick to talk, I would like you to open your mobiles and go to slido.com. Guys, can I have the next? Yeah, can I have the slido.com? Next one, please. Yeah. So if you type in www.slido.com, it will ask you to enter a code. And that code is 2274536. 2274536. This will allow you to ask questions at the very end after the panelists have finished. So instead of raising your hand, we will be taking questions on Slido. Okay? Right, thank you very much. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Nick Saville.
Thank you, Hanan, and thank you to Neus for setting the scene so neatly for this session. So the ever-present need for comparable evidence of foreign language learning. So just a few words to kick this off and to provide some background to the topic. When we say an ever-present need, we can go back at least 50 years with concrete examples. And in the European context, as we've already heard, we can point to the Council of Europe's first modern languages project conducted between 1964 and 1974, and this led to the threshold level of English and to the T-level series in over 40 languages, I think, during the following 2 decades. As at that time we started thinking about the concept of level and what it could mean across languages. And I think at that time it was rather loose, and as John Trim himself called it. Elsewhere in the USA, an ACTFL was established, I think in the late 60s, as an offshoot of the Modern Languages Association, and this led to the ACTFL proficiency guidelines and levels, which could be employed for assessing proficiency in different languages using a standardized scale. In the 1990s, we saw a growing interest emerging more widely in mechanisms for making systematic comparisons of proficiency across languages and across regions. So is your level the same as my level? And this meant that the concept of the level itself needed to be more closely defined. Of particular interest in this context here today was the establishment of the ALTAs framework starting in 1991, and following the second Rouchlicon conference in 1993, we saw the development of the Common European Framework of Languages, which was led by John Trim and the Council of Europe team, and as you know, that was published in 2001, as we've already heard. Nowadays, with its widely recognized 6-level system and extensive toolkit, including the recent additions we've heard about, such as the companion volume, the handbook for aligning materials, etc., the CFR provides what you could call the necessary apparatus for collecting comparable evidence across levels, across languages, across regions. So this has already been put into practice through the first European survey on language competencies that was conducted by the Surveyline group of ALTAs members on behalf of the European Commission between 2008 and 2011. And that first large-scale international survey actually revealed some of the major challenges of language learning in school contexts, and despite the use of very sophisticated methodologies, also the problems of making comparisons between different educational traditions and different educational factors. A small-scale study that I led on behalf of the Commission in 2015 confirmed the view that these comparisons were rather difficult, and that persuaded the EU and the Commission not to conduct further surveys and looked elsewhere, as we'll be hearing today, to take that forward. So I'll finish with just a couple of points from that Surveyline report, which I think are relevant to this panel when thinking about comparability and levels, and more generally to this conference when thinking about language policy and implementation of curricula, etc. First of all, it's crucial, this is a quote, it's crucial to understand the contextual dynamics and to set realistic policy goals in order to raise standards over time in local environments which truly value the benefits of multilingualism. So that's a really key point for this conference. Secondly, creating a joined-up approach to curriculum goals, provision of pedagogic materials, the application of a coherent assessment system, and the ongoing development of teachers should be at the heart of the policy. So therefore, I welcome very much the PISA 2025 framework as an extension of this, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the new opportunities that this will give us to collect the evidence of the kind that we need. Okay, so thanks. Over to you.
Thank you. So we'll be presenting on what matters for successful language learning from the point of view of a framework, the framework of the PISA 2025 Foreign Language Assessment. First, I'm going to give a brief description of the PISA program. So this stands for Program for International Student Assessment, and it's the world's largest survey of educational outcomes. We don't focus on individual student results, we focus on educational systems, the results of educational systems. And we have around 90 countries and economies participating in the most recent cycle. We have been doing this every 3 years since the year 2000, and we test a sample of students. So we don't go and assess every single student in a country, we select a representative sample. And we focus on 15-year-olds, they have to be students, and they have to be in grade 7 and above. Every cycle, we assess them in science, reading, and mathematics. They're the more traditional domains. But we also have what we call innovative domains. We change them each year, and there are things such as creative thinking, for example. And we also have options. And now, for the very first time in PISA 2025, we will have the option of English as a foreign language. In addition to the tests, we collect a lot of background information. This will allow us to contextualize the results because PISA doesn't want only to be able to describe what students can do, PISA also wants to be able to explain the results of students. What factors are really affecting student learning? So we asked the students to fill in a questionnaire. The school principals also fill in a questionnaire. We have a system-level questionnaire, and in some cases, we also ask parents and teachers to respond to questionnaire. So we have a lot of information. So what do countries get out of PISA? First, they get what we call an international benchmark. So they can compare the results of their students with the results of the students in other countries. And they can do this both by a score, so basically you can do a ranking, but you can also compare the percentage of students in each proficiency level. And this is perhaps more interesting for policy purposes, to know what your students really can do or what they cannot do. If countries participate more than once in PISA, and they normally do, we also allow for an analysis of trends. So you can see, have there been any changes in education or not? And in addition, we provide insights into what are the most efficient policies and practices from all across the world. So the idea, the ultimate goal of PISA is actually to help students learn better, to help teachers to teach better, and to make school systems be able to operate more effectively. Specifically now about the foreign language assessment program, this is the first global comparison of school systems on student proficiency in foreign languages since the 70s. We were advised by our governing board to rely on what's already out there. We were told, do not reinvent the wheel, don't get super creative, this is a very difficult thing for us, it has a lot of logistical constraints, play it safe. So we have really used the whole plethora of experiences that are out there. And for example, we did not design a framework specific for our tests. That's something that we normally do in PISA. We decided instead to align with the CFR. Because when we report the results by proficiency levels, the CFR levels mean something to countries already, because they're already using them in most cases for the national exams or the national standards. So if we said 50% of your students don't reach a level 5 in PISA, that doesn't really mean anything. But if we say instead, look, 50% of your students are A1 or below, okay, that means something in the community of English teachers. We have also relied a lot on the lessons from Saville and from the EA6 subject study. We will be offering this regularly because PISA happens regularly. So we can just latch on to PISA, and we will be offering every 2 PISA cycles. And this is a collaborative effort. PISA always is. In this specific case, we started working with countries to understand really what they wanted to answer, what they wanted to measure, what were the policy questions that they had. We also had guidance from foreign language experts on everything that had to do with the assessment design for the questionnaires, for the tests, for the frameworks. We have been developing the test under a partnership with Cambridge University Press and Assessment, and we have had very, very strong support from the European Commission. They have provided co-funding, technical expertise, and overall support since the very beginning of the project. This is the first cycle, PISA 2025. We've made some decisions that apply to this cycle. So the idea is to start small and go bigger in the future. First, it's a computer-based assessment. We will assess reading, listening, and speaking, specifically spoken production. We would have liked to include writing, but there were too many logistical restraints, and we had to choose, and we asked countries to rank the skills, and this was the ranking that won. We will go with 1 foreign language only, and it will be English. And again, we ask countries what was the language they were most interested in. We will also assess reading in the language of instruction. So this will enable us to make correlations between reading in English as a foreign language and reading in the language of instruction of the students. And the idea then is to expand in future cycles. And this is a list of the countries and economies that have signed up for this option. We're quite happy with the amount, 21, and with the diversity, because we want to be able to explain things. So for example, if all we had were countries where teachers' level of English is amazing, we wouldn't be able to explore what is the effect of the level of English of teachers. Well, if we have some countries where English teachers have a very good level, and some countries where maybe the teachers are not really English teachers, maybe they were just there and they were told, oh, you're teaching English this year. That is what enables us to really look at the effect of different kinds of variables. Over to Angeliki.
So what are the factors of successful foreign language learning? There is a lot of literature on the matter, and we know for sure that rich input or ample exposure to the foreign language is a key factor, because there is no such thing as too much input when it comes to foreign language learning. And alongside rich input, deliberative practice is also another key ingredient. And it's practice not only of knowledge of the language, grammar and vocabulary, but also of the 4 skills. And these are best learned through situationally and cognitively authentic tasks. We also know that we learn best when we are supported throughout the language learning process. We learn best when we receive actionable feedback that we can use to improve learning. And learning is best when it is combined with learning-oriented assessment that, for example, can provide this actionable feedback. And last but not least, we know that we learn best when we are engaged, motivated, and positively challenged by the language learning process. Okay. Catalina already touched on that, but the PISA foreign language assessment adopts not only, the CFR descriptive scheme, but another existing framework in a complementary way. And the second framework is the socio-cognitive framework for language test development and validation developed by Cyril Weir and colleagues, which acknowledges that language is a combination of cognitive processes, mental activity on the one hand, but also a social phenomenon, and says that language tests should elicit and assess both these dimensions. And we're going to show you how the CFR is interweaved throughout the framework, in addition, of course, to the reporting scheme of the levels. Okay, so how have we defined foreign language proficiency within PISA? Foreign language proficiency is the ability to use a foreign language to communicate effectively. A very straightforward, clear definition, but as you understand, the ability it describes is a very complex process that requires a combination of language and general competencies that allow learners to perform communicative language activities such as reception and production of language, interaction, mediation with language, and involves one or a combination of the 4 skills of reading, listening, speaking, and writing. And last but not least, it requires the activation of appropriate language strategies, for example, to know when to ask for help when you're stuck. And I'm sure you all recognize here that this description is based on the fundamentals of the CFR descriptive scheme. So this is another way that we have incorporated the CFR framework into the PISA foreign language assessment. So how does PISA view foreign language proficiency in practice? So it views foreign language proficiency as the combined outcome of 2 sources of influence, the learner and the task. And this in turn determine the cognitive processes that the learner employs when using a foreign language. And learner and task dimensions interact with each other within a broad sociocultural context, which in essence is the range of situations in which the learner learns and uses the language. And here is, the socio-cognitive aspect of, how language proficiency is viewed and implemented in PISA. And when we talk about learner factors, what we mean are things like motivation, prior foreign language exposure, self-efficacy, and the like. So these are some of the success factors that I mentioned earlier for successful second language learning. And in terms of task factors, we mean things like task purpose, function, complexity, linguistic demands, authenticity. Again, these are some of the other factors crucial for successful language learning that I've mentioned earlier. And cognitive processes, just to give you, a very brief overview of what we mean here, taking an example from listening. So when people listen to speech, what we do is, first of all, input decoding, identifying the phonemes in the stream of speech. Then using lexical knowledge, we do a lexical search to identify words out of the phonemes. Then we do syntactic parsing to group words into propositions, the equivalent of sentences in written speech. But in order to have comprehension, we need to do also meaning construction, enriching the meaning of the propositions with world knowledge, inferences, and the like. And if we are listening to an extended piece of speech, like you do now, then we also do a discourse construction, incorporating these initial propositions into what has gone on before and constructing, a discourse-level representation of meaning. Okay, so how does PISA foreign language assessment will assess these factors? Well, the task factors that we discussed, along with the cognitive processes that are elicited and the output of foreign language proficiency, will be captured by the test itself. Whereas, the learner factors alongside school and teacher factors, the parental influence, school system-level factors will be captured by the background questionnaires, which Catalina now is going to talk about.
So we've already described the kind of questionnaires that we have and how we will use them as a context for interpreting the results. And it's important to highlight that we will use them both as input, but sometimes as outputs too. So for example, if we consider students' attitudes towards learning English, that is probably going to be an input. It's a variable that we expect may have some effect on their results. But it's also an output of an educational system in itself, the attitudes that students have towards this. This is the framework that we built for the questionnaires. Here we built it ourselves, but using everything that was out there. And we have 4 main areas that are there in the boxes. So the first one is government and school policies. And an example of the kind of thing that we're looking at here is this: onset of target language learning at school, meaning what age were the students when they started learning English, or what grade were they in? Then we have teachers' training and profile. The kind of thing we will be looking at here is teachers' target language proficiency. Then we have teaching practices, such as to what extent are the 4 communicative skills being taught in the classroom or not? And finally, we have students and learning. And this one is always important. It's important if you're talking about maths, if you're talking about science, but we think that in this case it's particularly important because it's not just about what's going on at school, it's also about what's going on outside of school. So we want to have a lot of information, for example, about how much exposure do students have through the media? Do they watch movies in English or not? How many tourists are there in that country? What do students do in their free time that has to do with English? So basically, we want to know, is the school the only place they run into English? Or what other places do they run into English, and to what extent? And we also have 2 transversal topics. One is ICT, and the other one is the use of target language for instruction in other subjects. And finally, what will the FLA deliver to countries? So on one hand, international comparisons. Countries will have a result on a PISA scale. But they're also going to have a description of the proficiency levels of their students, actually from pre-A1 to C1. So the C2 there is wrong. And if they participate more than once, they will have trend data. Then they will also have national diagnostics. So by this we mean a very detailed description of the strengths and weaknesses of their students. For example, are they better in listening than they are in reading? But also a description of the achievement gaps and the variation. So to what extent do background factors affect the results? What happens if you compare urban schools with rural schools, boys with girls? What happens when you double-click on socioeconomic background? And also the relations between language skills, learning context, and exposure to foreign languages. And ultimately then, we expect to be able to provide policy and practice lessons. So to be able to identify what are the best practices worldwide, what seems to be working. This will help guide policy decisions, and it should inform and improve language teaching and learning not only in the participating countries, but also in countries that didn't participate in the assessment. Over to Martin.
Okay. Thank you, Catalina. So having looked at the PISA FLA framework and how that draws on aspects of two broader frameworks, the CFR and the socio-cognitive framework, I'm now going to look at how PISA 2025 will assess language proficiency. So just a brief overview of the tests, how they were created, and how they will be delivered. So just a quick reminder, what is PISA Foreign Language Assessment? So we'll be testing 15-year-olds. We'll be testing reading, listening, and speaking, but not writing. The test will be computer-based, including the test of speaking. The test content's created by Cambridge, and the speaking centrally marked by Cambridge. So what challenge does that present? Well, clearly, the content must be age-appropriate and culturally acceptable across the world. The tests must be multi-level. Across all the countries and contexts we'll be testing in, there'll be a huge range of levels. And the report results align to the CFR. So we'll be testing and measuring and reporting from pre-A1 up to C1. As it's a survey, there'll be no or little preparation or learning for the students. And as the tests will be delivered in compulsory education schools, not test centres, the test must be easy to administer for the schools. So, how is the content created? So, as we've mentioned before, we want to learn from previous similar studies, in this case, the European Survey of Language Competencies, or SurveyLang. We've created the framework, as described by Angeliki. Out of the framework, we create the test designs. We trial those test designs. Once we're happy with the test designs, we do the item writing, we pre-tested. Of course, Cambridge do their own reviews. And then all the content and all the material will be reviewed by the OECD and their experts. And then importantly, all of the content will then be reviewed again by all of the countries and all of their experts. So they will all have the opportunity to either approve and accept the material or decide that it's not culturally appropriate for their context, for example. Once the countries are happy with the content, we create the tests. There'll be a field trial next year, and then the main study in 2025. So the PISA reading and listening tests, computer delivered. Listening, a new approach for PISA, and possibly a new experience for many test takers. Of course, the tests must be multi-level, and to achieve that multi-level nature, the tests will be adaptive. So how do we achieve the adaptivity? So this is an example of a multi-stage adaptive test design that will be used in PISA. It looks quite complicated, but if we just look at the top left-hand corner, so a PISA reading test will be approximately 60 minutes long. That 60-minute test will be divided into 3 20-minute testlets. So if you look at the top left-hand corner there, each of those columns represents the 3 20-minute testlets. So the letters L is low, M, medium, H, high. So a low-level testlet of about 20 minutes will contain content that is pre-A1 and A1. A medium-level testlet will contain content that is A2 and B1. The high-level testlet will contain content that is B2 and C1. So for one particular student, they start on the left with a medium-level testlet. If they perform well on that testlet, they'll receive a high-level testlet. If they perform well again, they'll be presented with another high-level testlet. If they don't do so well, they'll be presented with a medium-level testlet. And that pattern can be repeated across the survey. And it'd be a similar design for listening. So the listening will be about 30 to 40 minutes. Moving on to the speaking test. So again, the speaking test is computer delivered. So just to emphasize, there is no examiner, no interlocutor. A student will be sat at a computer answering questions that the computer presents. So the tests will be multi-level. They're not adaptive. They'll be marked centrally by Cambridge. This is a new approach for PISA, and almost certainly, in many cases, it will be a new experience for the students. So we want to make the question types, we want to use familiar question types, and if they're not familiar, at least as intuitive as we can make them, so nothing complicated. So the speaking test is about 15 or 20 minutes. In the 15 minutes, there are 4 parts. So I'm just going to show a couple of examples from the 4 parts. So part 1, this is talking about yourself. There'll be 7 or 8 questions. They'll start with some fairly simple questions. So the example here, what did you do yesterday? As the questions move on, they'll get a little bit more challenging and hopefully elicit more higher level content from those candidates. So the example here, which I'm struggling to read, tell me about a movie or TV show you really like. You can say what it is, what it's about, what you like. Part 4 is an opportunity for a longer response. So here it's talking about a topic. The question, is it important for young people to do these things and why? And there you have a number of examples. They'll have 40 seconds to prepare and just over 2 minutes to respond. Going back to the description of the framework that Angeliki mentioned, we can see here that for each question type in the framework, we will have specified what's happening in that question itself. So the cognitive processes, the CFR scales that we're aligned to, and the functions being tested. The marking of the speaking test. So marking will be managed centrally by Cambridge using experienced examiners, and we hope to achieve quality assurance that will achieve consistency and fairness across the countries, and the results aligned to the CFR. And finally, just to remind ourselves of why we're doing PISA FLA, it's about international comparison, national diagnostics, and learning lessons about policy and practice, and hopefully in some way informing and improving language teaching and learning across those countries. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, panelists. And thank you for sending in questions. So just a reminder for those of you who still would like to send questions in, if I can go back, I don't know. It's slido.com, and yeah, I'm not going back here. Okay, Nick, can I? Okay, so the first question that came in is to Catalina. So Catalina, what is the process for countries to join PISA foreign language assessment? And what is the process for selecting schools within participating countries?
Hello? Oh, yeah. Thank you, Hanan. So to join the FLA, they must first be participating in PISA. So this is an option for all countries participating in PISA 2025. And then they have to make the decision to join. So it's partly a political decision, and they also have to pay a fee. So they have to have some resource available for this. And that's the same process we always have with PISA options. So this is not the only option. We also ask them, do you want to take the teacher questionnaire, for example? In terms of selecting schools, we select the schools for the countries. So we have an institution specialized on sampling, and they design very specific sampling procedures. First, we sample schools, and once the schools have been sampled, then we sample the students. And this is done centrally, so we ask countries to provide a list of all the schools that may have 15-year-olds in them, and then is when we make the choice of what are the schools that will be selected to participate, to make sure it's really a representative sample. So we take into account characteristics of the school too when we make this choice.
And Catalina, another question to you. Why writing is not included in the PISA assessment?
So when we started off with this, we didn't know any of the decisions we were going to make, so we didn't really know what skills to look at. And PISA is traditionally a reading test. So the only thing that we knew we could do easily was reading. But countries told us, like, come on, that's not a foreign language test. We need to go beyond that. But because this happens in schools, we have a lot of logistical restraints. There have to be computers in the schools. The test administrators are either from the school or from the Ministry of Education. When you talk about 4 tests instead of 1 test, it gets more expensive, more logistically complex. And we were also told by the advisory board to keep it simple, so we don't have countries that don't join just because it was too complicated, just because it was too expensive. So what we did was we asked the countries to rank the skills, and writing came in last, so that's why we dropped it. But not because we don't think writing is important, it's just we couldn't do all 4 skills in this first cycle.
Thank you. And another question, will the speaking test be adaptive, and if so, how? I guess this goes to you, Martin.
Yep. The speaking test, we would like to make it adaptive, but in an adaptive test, you have to mark the previous response in order to work out which question to give them next. We can do that with selected responses very quickly in reading and listening, not yet in speaking. So in this cycle of PISA, the speaking test won't be adaptive. Hopefully in future cycles it will. So we are hopefully going to develop adaptive speaking tests and writing tests in the future.
Thank you, Martin. What is new about listening on PISA, the slide before the multi-stage adaptive diagrams slide?
Yep, the newness is really to PISA in general. They do literacy, for example, it's reading, maths, it's all kind of read. There's no listening test. So the students in the PISA context won't have done a listening test.
So may I add that it's new from the logistical point of view, because if you have to include headsets, that's really like a game changer in terms of collecting the data, and to make sure that all countries have the same quality of headsets, and for countries that may be really difficult sometimes just to buy headsets because it has to do with budget lines, or maybe you're forced to use what you have in schools. So what may seem kind of easy isn't really easy in the PISA context. And beyond the logistics, we have just never done a test of listening. So you have to start rethinking everything that you wouldn't do in a normal reading test.
And the question types themselves are not new. We purposely selected question types that are very commonly known, because the students, they won't be learning or familiarizing themselves with the PISA tests. They'll just be selected to do the test. So we wanted to make it as straightforward as possible for those students.
Thank you. Angeliki, you mentioned that there is already a lot of literature on factors contributing to successful SLA. So what else do you expect PISA data will add?
Yeah, I did mention that we know a lot about successful language learning. However, what I didn't mention is that this knowledge comes from small studies and surveys across different contexts. And what I presented is, what people have done is a very rough summary of what, success depends on. Whereas, as Catalina mentioned, PISA will be, the first grand-scale survey of this type with thousands of students since probably, the 70s, that all of them across different contexts, their output will be controlled, the same test, same conditions, and also providing us, apart from, in addition to their output in terms of their language, we will get all this rich information about the background factors. So this is unique, and it has the potential to qualify quite a bit, dig deeper into this picture. Definitely, we know input will still come up as a very, important factor, but how much input or early onset, we know that, it plays a role, but what else needs to be in place in order to make that, successful? So we expect lots of, elaboration of the current picture.
Thank you. Catalina?
Can I add something? So when we started working on the framework for the questionnaires, and then when we started developing the questionnaires, again, we had to choose. Because we know there's so many variables that have been proved to impact the learning of English as a foreign language. But we have very reduced questionnaire time. So that, for example, the school principal is already answering a questionnaire for PISA, and we have about 5, or I think we negotiated perhaps 10 additional minutes at the end for questions that are specific for foreign languages. So we don't have a lot of space to ask these questions, the same in the student one. So we didn't want this to be just an academic exercise, so we did look at what academia says. We did talk to experts, but that's why we talked a lot with countries, because we want to know what do they want to get out of this from the point of view of policy? What are the policy questions that they have? And basically, we ask countries again to rank. Look, these are all the things we can ask. What are the things that are more relevant for you from the point of view of policy? And then some things just had to be dropped because we didn't have enough space.
Nick, sorry, I need, because I have loads of questions. Yeah, Nick, what role could ALTAs play in the upcoming PISA, FLA, and future cycles?
Well, obviously, we're playing a role here today by helping to raise awareness of what's going on and to allow us to have a conversation about the way PISA will work now and how it might work in the future. As you see, the focus is on English, and that's by choice because of the demand from the countries. But we in ALTAs have been looking at placing at the heart of what we do a plurilingual learner, right? So at the heart of our thinking is that the person who's learning English will already know 1, 2, 3 or other languages. So it's really important in thinking about what we've heard today to match the test, which is thinking about levels and competencies, with context. Because increasingly in placing that plurilingual learner at the heart, we're looking at all of the factors around her that help her to learn English on top of other languages. And increasingly, we see the other languages as being a facilitator in many cases, potentially not in some other cases, but we're looking at how the whole learner as a plurilingual person develops and how we add in and understand a target language like English. So we will be supporting the current phase through helping people to understand what's going on. But I think we'll come on later to help when we think about, well, what about a survey on French and other languages which might emerge from the needs of the member states, because that's how it will happen, presumably. If no one asks for it, it won't get done. If people ask for it, then we can draw on the experience we had, for example, with SurveyLang, which sought to develop tests which are of a parallel kind, delivering parallel levels, which is at the heart of what ALTAs has been doing for 30 years.
Thank you, Nick. I have a few questions about results, yeah? Will students be informed individually about their level in the English language? Are you planning to report an overall language score? If so, how are you going to combine scores?
So we don't provide individual student responses, partly because we don't have them. So the whole approach is that this is a sample, so students get little pieces of the tests. This is a very basic explanation of something that's more technical. There's no one student that answers all the questions, because we're not aiming at that. We're aiming at overall results. And this is the same for all PISA. We just don't have individual responses, and we work with plausible values. So the whole approach is designed to provide results at the group level, not at the individual level. In terms of the overall score, we've had a lot of discussions. You may notice I purposely didn't say anything about it. What we will provide is a score for each skill. And we have been having discussions about whether it would be appropriate to have some kind of average. If we do it, I think it would just be a simple average. I don't think we'd do anything more sophisticated.
Thank you. Martin, a few questions for you.
Yeah.
So if you want to note this down. So does the speaking test involve interaction or only oral production? Are the questions presented in a written form?
Yep, there's no interaction. That is one constraint of a computer-based test, obviously. It's production, yes. It's about a 15-minute test. The timed responses add up to about 8.5 minutes, which is actually, when you think about it, is very efficient. 8.5 minutes of response in a 15-minute test. Normally, in a per candidate examiner, that would be 3 people sharing that 15 minutes. So it's actually quite effective in getting 8.5 minutes responses. The questions will be presented both on the screen and orally.
Thank you. And what criteria will be used to assess speaking? Will they be known to learners?
Good question about the learners. I'm not sure how much in advance. I don't think so. So we will have a mark scheme. The examiners will use. It's a general mark scheme.
We don't communicate them in advance.
You don't communicate?
We don't communicate it to the test takers.
Okay.
So I don't think, as we mentioned, it's not the intention that students will be learning or preparing for the survey. So.
Okay. And how did you choose the 40 seconds preparation in speaking task?
Through trialing. We have similar task types in use already in some of our Cambridge exams. When we developed the test for PISA, we obviously drew on that experience, but then we've gone through a whole series of trialing and adjusted things according to the results we get from the trialing.
Thank you. Catalina, a few for you. So, will bilingual schools, L1 plus English, be in the sample? How could this affect results?
So I'm just trying to remember the exact definition that we have, but the definition that we have is that this assessment is appropriate for students whose first language of instruction is not English. And we're defining the first language of instruction as the language in which they take the PISA reading test. So that's a very self-centered definition, but that's how we work in PISA. So you may be taught in English or you may be taught in English, but it shouldn't be considered your main language of instruction. So bilingual schools may fall there or not, depending on the approach.
Thank you. Will all students in all countries take the same test? Are there components that are exclusive to certain countries?
It's the same test, and that is the difficulty that we have been trying to explain. So the same test from the point of difficulty, though we know that some countries will have a higher level than others, and the same test from the point of view of cultural appropriateness. That is the challenge we always have in PISA.
Can I just add something to that as well? I think something that may be interesting. In a normal testing environment, we normally create one test and give that one actual test to many candidates. In a survey, as you saw when I put up that test design, different students get different parts of that construct. So because we're testing a population here and not giving the same test to all the individuals, our test construct is actually many hours long for the reading, which is, we have a much better opportunity to test a whole construct with a population than you do with any individual. With an individual test, you're restricted and you create a 1-hour test, and then you go into domain sampling and you're only testing part of that construct. So this is a great opportunity to actually test a much longer, broader construct.
Thank you. What procedures have you used to align to the CFR, standard setting, etc.?
Yeah, if I can answer that. As we said, the items, as Martin mentioned, they have been already calibrated, pre-trialed, reviewed, and this is also how we aligned, to the CFR. We haven't done a specific standard setting exercise. but based on, these are items that were specifically commissioned, for the assessment, plus also information from already existing item banks.
And are there plans to... Sorry? Okay. Are there plans to provide familiarization materials to allow students to be more at ease with the format of the speaking test?
Not specifically. This is a big challenge in PISA because it's a very gray area about what is familiarization and what is training for the test. And the whole point is a representative sample is a random sample that will represent what all students in a country know. At the same time, we are aware that particularly in some contexts, students may not be familiar with the computer assessment. So for the current cycle, we are giving guidelines on what is acceptable and what is not. And it is okay to kind of familiarize students with the idea of a computer-based test, but we don't want them to train. And at the very beginning of the test, we have a section with instructions. We make sure they understand the logic, that they have a chance to try out things, so they won't be confused by the instructions.
Thank you. There was a question about the countries that are participating in 2025. I pulled out the list, but there's also a question, Catalina, about can countries still participate? Can they still apply?
If they change their mind today. Okay, so officially we've closed the registration procedure because we're already working on this. So large-scale assessments have very long timelines. So countries are currently preparing. They're getting the headsets, they're estimating the sample size, they're preparing for the logistics, they have to translate the instruments, they have to translate the questionnaires. So we have begun the work. But if a country suddenly decides they want to join, yes, it's totally negotiable.
And, sorry, go ahead, Nick.
No, I was going to say, picking up on the theme of plurilingualism, it is plurilingual because the contextual information, the instructions to the learners, how they are told about what's happening, it's in the language of instruction of their country. So we're trying to set it up so they can engage with the foreign language bit with an understanding of what's going on, which obviously doesn't happen in normal language tests like the Cambridge ones, where the students get the instructions in English when they read the questions.
And a question about countries as well. What happens if the countries consider in 2024 that the content topics are not appropriate? Do you have time to create new items?
No time to do anything. So if a country wants to speak out, it's this year, we will send all the items to them. If they think this is something they really, really cannot live with, okay, we may consider dropping it if a lot of countries say that. In very exceptional circumstances, we may consider dropping it just for that specific country. But this is the general PISA approach. If we really wanted all 90 countries to be delighted with every single item, we wouldn't have a test.
Thank you. How does PISA FLA assessment include learners with special needs? Any provision for special considerations?
So this is also a very big challenge we have in PISA. So we do build our computer-based tests following, I forgot the specific concept, but there's a name about what items should follow in terms of item construction, international accessibility. So we do follow those guidelines. I don't think we'll be able to provide specific ones in the case of foreign language assessment, but we will have to look into particularly, I think, the speaking test, if there are any students with difficulties to respond to that.
Thank you. And our last question today is to Nick Saville. So Nick, with PISA for foreign language assessment and with English being the very first language coming in, this of course would have implications for other languages as well. So the question is, how do you see the role of English evolving over the next decade and post the first implementation of PISA?
Well, that's a very interesting thing to speculate about. But obviously, the reality which PISA is reflecting here is that English has become a global lingua franca and exists in all education systems. We're talking about in instructed learning here, so within policy contexts and within curricula. So English has emerged in the last 3 decades as the primary language of target language for foreign language learning. The future of English has been looked at recently by the British Council, and they've just published a book about it, and it seems likely that English will retain this role. So we're looking at how English and other languages exist side by side in the school context and in the community context, and how people learn English as well as, of course, other languages. So English is not a killer language, in my opinion. It's there not to take over and eradicate home languages, languages of schooling, regional languages, and so forth. So how can we then think about how we build plurilingual repertoires to meet the needs of our learners, and how can we ensure that when we find things out, we can then shine the light on what good practice should look like and seek to implement policy. So that's why I think this approach, which puts a lot of emphasis on the contextual dimension of where the language learning is happening, is really important, because we're not seeking just to provide a level system with a kind of who's at the top and who's at the bottom scale. We know those things can be interesting, but we want to know why and how the language learning is happening. So I think in the future we'll see the need for surveys of other languages, and I think we'll see that this will shed a lot of light on how language learning takes place, which can be shared across all language communities.
Thank you, Nick. We've been signaled to stop. Thank you so much for listening to us, and muchas gracias.